Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There are some in Congress who think we should have a fire sale on public lands, places across national forests and the Bureau of Land Management lands that politicians think should be offered for sale, either to try to adopt President Trump's one big beautiful bill that would continue to offer the biggest tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and corporations, or simply because they don't believe there should be public lands. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. This legislation, sponsored primarily by U.S. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, could be the most devastating public lands measure to come before Congress. If passed, it could drastically reshape the West. While Interior Secretary Doug Burgum says many of the lands that could be affected are often barren land next to highways with existing billboards that have no recreational value, many disagree. There's a hue and cry across the West that that's not exactly the case, that many of these lands are used by hunters and anglers, by birders and backpackers, four-wheelers, and by weekend campers. To get into the weeds of this legislation, our guest this week is Mike Carroll, director of the BLM program for the Wilderness Society. We'll be back in a minute with Mike.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Mike.
Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you making the time. It's a busy time, as we all know, in the news business. Tell us, before we get into the legislation, what exactly does the director of the Wilderness Society's BLM program do?
Well, the great thing about the Wilderness Society is that we have a big team of people, all with different specialities across the organization. Mine just happens to be running campaigns and engaging with lawmakers and basically taking policy and policy recommendations, primarily around BLM lands, and translating those into campaigns on the ground to work with members of Congress, local communities to try and implement conservation efforts on the ground.
So you've probably been a busy guy this year.
Yeah, I mean, look, we were extremely excited at the end of the Biden administration because of the work that was being done by the BLM during the Biden administration to put in place new regulations like the public lands rule that they had worked on for a number of years that would have put conservation on equal footing with other uses of BLM lands. We thought that was, a long overdue piece of policy to be put in place. And we were very excited to see it actually get enacted by the Biden administration. And then we walked towards the towards the election last fall and saw that we were going to be faced with another Trump administration. And sadly, I think that balanced approach to conservation we've already started, or balanced approach to management we've already seen start to erode here drastically in only the first few months of the Trump administration.
Now, let's be clear. I grew up in the East Coast and probably didn't realize what a BLM was or how much national forest land there was in the country. And this legislation is focused specifically on the West. Is that correct? I mean, there are no lands in the East or the South or the Midwest that are involved in this legislation.
Yeah, the legislation is pretty clear that it focuses on selling off land in 11 states across the West: Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. So those are the states where there could conceivably be lands identified by any interested party, by the way. That's what it says in the legislation. Any interested party can identify a piece of land that qualifies to be sold. Right now, there's about, in our estimation, and we've put a map out that people have probably seen. It's been widely shared across the West and across the country. We have a map out that shows that what we're really talking about here, when you actually crunch the numbers and look at the maps and where these places are 258 million acres that could be up for sale. The legislation itself caps their sales at 3 million acres, but 258 million are on the menu, could be chosen from to be sold.
You know, in my introduction, I said that it could drastically reshape the West. It carries the potential for that. And I haven't seen a state by state breakdown on the acres being discussed, but when you look across the West, nearly 65% of Utah is owned by the federal government, nearly half of Wyoming, more than 80% of Nevada, and more than 60% of Idaho, and more than 50% of Oregon. I mean, how many of those acres could be targeted by this legislation in theory?
Well, Kurt, I'll give you the chart that breaks down all those acres, and you can post it to your website when we're done. Look, the numbers are astronomical, and it's not just, normally when we talk about these large acreage figures, and Alaska's on the list, a lot of the acreage comes from Alaska, right? That's no different here. 82 million acres are on the chopping block or the auction block from Alaska. But you mentioned a bunch of states in the lower 48 that people spend a lot of time traveling to for vacations and out on the public lands. The numbers there are equally as shocking. Let me start with Nevada. 33 million acres in Nevada, 33.5 million acres actually, could be sold off. In Idaho, 21 million acres could be sold off, or at least chosen from, right? 21 million acres are on the auction block potentially. You've got 14 million acres in Arizona, 18 million acres in Utah, 5 million acres in Washington, and 14 million acres in Wyoming. So the numbers are astronomical that could be implicated in the language around the Senate bill. People are like, it's important to, Kurt, to tell people that these aren't far-flung places in the middle of nowhere necessarily, right? These are people's recreation sites. They're local communities, open space and trails and mountain biking areas and hiking areas. It's not just, Senator Lee likes to talk about these are far-flung places out in the middle of nowhere that are underutilized. These are places people care about and are, cherish. For me, living in Durango, Colorado, I live in Durango because of the access to BLM lands that are right adjacent to our community. One of our marquee places is Animas Mountain, which is a mountain just outside of our, 5 blocks from my house. And it has mountain bike trails and hiking trails, and the community loves and uses that place all the time. It could be up for sale if it's identified by any, I think the language in the bill is any interested party. If they nominate the place and the secretary approves it and puts it on for sale, it could be sold off. So the communities stand to lose a lot across the West if this bill moves forward.
You didn't mention Montana.
I didn't mention Montana. That's an interesting subject, right?
I
You
knew
know,
we'd get to it.
I think there's a lot to say about Montana. As I think probably your readers and listeners may have heard, this sell-off attempt in the Senate started in the House, and there was a House proposal that was introduced earlier this spring that included acreages in Utah and Nevada for sale. And Representative Zinke at the time, who is from Montana, he's also President Trump's first Interior Secretary, I'll remind people, stood up and said he was a hard no on any public land sell-off. And he stuck to that and has really been an amazing champion for drawing a bright line. And ultimately, Senator Zinke and a handful, including not Senator Zinke, I'm upgrading him, Representative Zinke and Representative Simpson and a handful of other members, Representative Simpson from Idaho, stood up and basically said, no, we do not want public land sell-off in a budget bill. This is not the place to address public land sales and doing it through a budget bill that doesn't have the normal oversight, normal committee hearings, all that type of stuff. They were a hard no. And ultimately, they got the House provision stripped. The challenge has been when the Senate's provision came up, you had Senator Daines and Senator Sheehy from Montana who began having conversations with Senator Lee about their opposition. They've said in numerous interviews and publicly that they oppose public land sales. But rather than drawing a hard line in the sand, which we hoped they would, they've continued to have conversations with Senator Lee about his piece of legislation to try and improve it. One of the things that's happened in that time period, which we think was by design by Senator Lee, is that Montana was exempted. It's why you didn't hear me list off the acreage in Montana, which would have been significant. We think, the Montana delegation has been pushing hard to really bring their concerns over public land sell-off to Senator Lee. And Senator Lee decided to exempt Montana in the hopes of buying off their votes, frankly. I think we're going to see in the coming days whether or not that works or whether or not Senator Daines and Senator Sheehy really stick to their guns and follow the lead of Representative Zinke in Montana and draw a bright line and insist that this gets stripped out of the Senate package.
Yeah, yeah. Now you're more deeply involved with this legislation, the nooks and crannies of it, than I am for sure. Explain to me. Initially, we heard that between 2 and 3 million acres of BLM lands and Forest Service lands would be eligible to be put up for sale. Now the Wilderness Society is saying that could actually balloon, and that's a big balloon, to 258 million acres. What's the difference?
So, Kurt, that's a great question about the acreage. I think it's important to point out to folks that, the 3 million acres that I think a lot of people originally heard about is still there. It's a 3 million acre cap in terms of the sale. However, the acreage that could be chosen from, in other words, the acreage that could be nominated across the West, originally in the first iteration of the language that was introduced by Senator Lee, was roughly 120 million acres that were identified. We reached that number at the Wilderness Society by essentially looking at the text of Senator Lee's bill and excluding the acres that they said would not be up for sale, which are federally protected lands and lands that had valid and existing rights on them, which they defined as being grazing permits, mining claims, and oil and gas development. When you did that sort of exclusion process and then put it into ArcGIS for the lands that are out there, and then you targeted or you looked at the states that they said that where the lands would have to come from, basically the acreage that you could select from for sale that would be up for sale was the 120 million acres. The reason the number jumped over the course of last weekend to 258 million acres is because the Senate and Senator Lee changed the language in the bill to actually line out the specific definitions in the legislation for what constituted a valid and existing right. So they lined out grazing permits as a valid and existing right for what they would consider a valid and existing right. As I'm sure you and your listeners and readers know, the vast majority of the public lands across the West are open to grazing. So when you have grazing lands exempt or not up for sale, the number of acres goes down to that 120 million acres. When you add back in the acres that are grazed and those grazing permits lands, the acreage jumps to 258 million acres. So we base the map on the language that's actually in the bill in terms of how we developed it. But that's why you see those astronomical numbers. It's important to note the acreage for sale would be capped at 3 million acres. The menu that they can choose from is 258 million acres. I think, Senator Lee and his proponents and his supporters are going to say, hey, it's only 3 million acres. But if it's 1 acre that you care about and that you hike in, that you depend on for hunting or visiting, or that your family's gone to for years for vacation, I think it's cold comfort to say, oh, it's only 3 million acres, right? Because people will be losing some of their favorite places.
Then there's always the possibility that if this legislation passed, that cap might increase by future Congresses.
Well, and that's important, Kurt, to note, right? One of the most, troubling parts of this is this really is going to establish the precedent for Congress to basically say, hey, anytime they have a project that they need to fund, say they want to fund another tax cut in 4 years or 3 years, right? Well, then they're going to go back to the well and say, hey, maybe we should do another one of those rounds of selling off federal public lands to pay for this tax cut. Doing this through a budget reconciliation process is a slippery slope, and it's one that really would kick open the door to them using federal public land sales to fund any pet project that they want into the future.
Some of those lands are wilderness areas, right? That could be affected.
So, I mean,
wilderness study areas.
Yeah, wilderness study areas. Yeah. Fortunately, let me sort of address what's not in for a moment. The one positive here is that federally protected areas like wilderness areas, for example, like national parks, like national monuments, all of those federally protected areas have been exempted from the bill, from the potential sales. So those protected areas won't be on the chopping block. However, many of the areas where communities recreate a lot, and some of the most cherished areas that people care about in their backyards, our wilderness study areas, our areas of critical environmental concern, our wildlife habitat areas, all of those areas that are protected administratively, so protected by the agencies that manage them, not by law in statute, those areas are subject to sale. And there are millions and millions of acres of those areas, as you know, and as we pointed out with our map, that could be actually on the menu for the senator to sell off. So, these are not just any old run-of-the-mill lands out in the middle of nowhere, as Senator Lee might want you to believe. These are actually identified areas for future protection by Congress and administrated as such.
And some of them are out in the middle of no place, middle of nowhere, which makes them extremely important. Here in Utah, San Rafael Swell is mostly a wilderness study area of BLM lands. And you go back to the 1930s, and there was a proposal that the area was so loved and so magnificent that there was a proposal to turn it into a national park. Wayne Wonderland National Park, I think, was the proposed name. It never happened, but again, it's protected many wilderness study areas across the swell. The cultural, the historical, the scenic grandeur of that place is just incredible. Looking at the maps that have been generated to pinpoint these eligible lands, many national parks seem to be not exactly in the bullseye, but certainly on the board, not by having lands inside the parks themselves sold, but lands nearby or even abutting the parks. Isn't that right? I mean, places like Mount Rainier National Park, Olympic National Park, Canyonlands National Park, Yellowstone even. And then there's the interesting case of Sunset Crater Volcano National Monument in Arizona. a magnificent place of geological and cultural history. But looking at the map, it seems to be entirely surrounded by eligible lands. Is that actually the case?
Yeah, it is. And that's in part why we produced the map, right? We wanted people to see what was at stake around some of their favorite areas across the West and what could potentially be sold off. The interesting thing that I think gets lost in all of this is people dismiss the sell-off provisions by saying, "Oh, well, national parks aren't included. Those protected areas that Michael was talking about earlier aren't included." Well, the reality is many of the lands just adjacent to them, right up to the borders of those national parks and national conservation areas and those types of places, those areas are definitely going to be some of the first places that are identified by land speculators, by folks that want to build their, mini mansion or their vacation home right adjacent to Zion National Park or Olympic National Park, those types of places are going to be coveted by those folks because they can nominate them. The language in the bill says any interested party can nominate an area. They can nominate them, and if approved and put up for sale, they can actually purchase them.
But I thought this whole land sale proposal was designed to create affordable housing.
Well, again, I think that's a veil to push through and to obfuscate the ultimate intention here, which is really to try and push through the precedent of large scale sell off of public lands to fund tax cuts and to fund other things that they're doing. They want people to, look, there are real housing crises across the West, right? And housing is a really big issue across the West. But there's nothing in this piece of legislation that actually addresses housing in any huge way in terms of addressing affordability, addressing people's ability to have, lands that are adjacent to existing infrastructure, all of those types of things. This is about trying to get to a place where they can do large scale sell off to land speculators, billionaires, and major national corporations to develop them.
Does the legislation specify where any of the dollars would flow?
Yeah, the legislation does break down the dollars to give some of it back to local municipalities where these lands would be sold, and some of the acreage back to the general fund or the treasury in them. So that is part of the mix that they've been trying to um, it's part of the spin, I believe, that they've been trying to push forward, saying, these lands will go back to the local municipalities so that they can actually use them for infrastructure improvements there. They call that out in the bill, but ultimately these will go back to the general fund, and a large chunk of them will go back to the general fund, and we'll find ourselves in a situation where we've lost some of our most important natural treasures and really not gotten much for it.
I'm wondering. I mean, how do you put a price on some of these lands? I mean, Interior Secretary Burgum has said, what, we've got a trillion or $100 trillion in equity in the national lands, and if we're going to start selling them off, I mean, doesn't that impact his plan to balance the books?
Yeah, I mean that's what I think is funny. Once they're sold, right? So that's a one-time gain, right? So I don't understand how that fits with Secretary Burgum's equation that we should be trying to balance the books with our, greatest asset, the national public lands, right? Any investor will tell you don't sell your greatest asset in all of this. So he continues to kind of bang on that rhetoric. And it's dumbfounding to all of us to try and get our arms around like these natural wonders and the best idea that we've had as a nation, having national parks and public lands, right? How you would basically say, hey, let's just go ahead and sell these off to the highest bidder for one-time gain. That ultimately we won't be able to balance the books or justify the debt, pay off the debt by just selling these federal public lands.
Yeah. And then the other thing, I mean, we're talking the West here. It's an arid place. John Wesley Powell, more than a century ago, said, there's not enough water out here to sustain a large population. I wonder how that's factored into all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of large question marks that are not factored into this in the rush to try and push the sale of these lands through the Congress. They're not addressing, as we talked about, any of the affordability issues with regards to housing that they claim that they are addressing. They're also not addressing, what do these lands actually, you talked about the revenue that we've generated over the years from these lands and the push to try and maximize energy development and other development on it. None of the conversation here actually addresses like what implication would the sale of these lands have on oil and gas development, on grazing, on outfitter and guide permitting, right? On your local boat launch and your local boat community and the permits that they generate from around there. There's no real conversation about this. They're just rushing to sell off the federal public lands, and that's part of why doing this through a budget reconciliation process is really deeply concerning to those of us who work on federal public lands because there's no oversight. There's no committee hearings. There's no public comment period. There's no way for the public to provide their feedback and what they'd like to see other than, podcasts and news stories where people are actually out there trying to say, hey, this is wildly unpopular and they shouldn't do it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm here in Park City, Utah, and I know a lot of the locals are upset about that, and they've complained about trying to reach Senator Lee's office, and either nobody's answering the phone or his voicemail is filled up, and try again some other time. But again, here in Utah, some of the concerns are the forest lands, the national forest lands between Salt Lake City and Park City, great backcountry ski areas, some mountain biking areas, parts of the Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest, which draws thousands of recreators each weekend, could also theoretically be put on the block. What other prominent lands across the West have you identified at risk?
I mean, like I said, there's 258 million acres across the West that are potentially on the auction block. I can just give you a few. Let me start with the one right in the backyard where I live. I mentioned this earlier, but Animas Mountain is one of the great mountain biking areas and recreation areas in the town of Durango, Colorado, in southern Colorado. I moved to the town of Durango years ago, in part because of the mountain biking, in part because of the access to the outdoors. Animas Mountain, I live right down the street from. It's a place that I spend at least 2 days a week going through and hiking in, taking my wife and my dog up there and going for long hikes together. So it would be a huge loss for our community and for myself personally. Let me give you a couple other places. I grew up in Idaho, spent a lot of time. I went to the College of Idaho, spent a lot of time in Southwest Idaho, and the Owyhee Mountains and the Owyhee Canyonlands have numerous parcels that have been identified that could be up for sale. You'll recall that a number of years ago, the Idaho congressional delegation worked for years and years through a collaborative process with the local counties to protect the Owyhee Canyonlands. Now, some of those very places that are back in there in those canyons could be sold off, and some of the beautiful mountains in the Owyhee Mountains chain could be sold off. In Colorado, jumping back over the border into Colorado, where into the northern part in Grand Junction, I'll just point this out. I mentioned a lot of these places that people use every day, right? For me, it's Animas Mountain. Well, in Grand Junction, there's a trail network and a trail system on BLM lands called the Lunch Loops. It's called the Lunch Loops because people go out there in the middle of the day to ride their bikes and to go recreate. The Lunch Loops could be identified for sale in Colorado or in Grand Junction and potentially on the chopping block. Let me jump to California because there's some places there that I think are worth noting too. Yosemite National Park. Kurt, you were talking about the acreages that come right up to the edge of national parks. Well, there's significant acreage that's at risk in the Sierra National Forest near the town of El Porto that is just adjacent to Yosemite National Park. These lands are, prime recreation areas right up to the border of the national park. And if they're sold off and developed, you could see large scale developments being put into those particular places. So some of the most iconic national parks, the ones where John Muir and the founders of the conservation community started, could be actually on the auction block if the piece of legislation goes through. Kurt, I could go through a list all day long across the West. It's
Well, I think you mentioned the other day Bora Peak in Idaho
Yeah,
could
it's
go.
suffice to say that there's tons of them. Look, yeah, in Idaho, I'll talk all day about Idaho, but in Idaho, the thing that shocked me when we actually started to look at the maps, Kurt, were that four of the five highest 12,000-foot peaks, it's a thing in Idaho to get on your list bagging all the 12,000-foot peaks, just like in Colorado, everybody does the 14ers. Well, four of the five 12,000-foot peaks are on the chopping block in terms of being sold, including Mount Bora, which is, the highest peak in the state of Idaho and one of the most iconic places in the state of Idaho. So, yeah, there's a lot at risk and at stake for folks across the West in terms of the places that could be sold off.
Well, and you touched on it a little while ago about the economic impact. I mean, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of outfitters who rely on these public lands for hunting and fishing or river running or mountain bike tours. I mean, that's got to be an incredible impact in an industry that's obviously concerned over this legislation.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest allies and the biggest communities that we've seen stand up and try and push back against these public land sales are, in fact, the recreation community and outfitter and guides, right? Outfitter and guides have for years had their permits on these public lands. Many of the boat launches that they use for river rafting or the backcountry areas that they use for hunting and fishing camps, those types of things. Many of those places could be actually up for sale in all of this. So we've seen many of those communities standing up. The outdoor industry is over the last few years become a $1 trillion industry in this country, right? It continues to see astronomical growth in terms of sales and just that sector of the economy growing across the West. And many communities like my hometown of Durango are dependent on recreation dollars coming into those communities and those communities having access to federal public lands that are right out their back door. It's a huge economic driver for all these communities. And if they start selling off the public lands in those particular places, it'll cause a huge economic hit to communities like Durango and others, not to mention all of those outfitter and guides and the folks that work in the recreation community that depend on it for their livelihoods.
Some years ago, I think it was during President Trump's first term when he shrank the size of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The outdoor industry was so upset and angry over that the outdoor retailer industry show left Salt Lake City, where it had been for years, and went to Denver. Recently, it moved back to Salt Lake City. I'll be curious to see if Senator Lee's behavior prompts it to leave the state again and take quite a significant economic impact with it.
Look, I think if this piece of legislation moves forward, you're going to see a lot of accountability for these lawmakers that didn't stand up or didn't do enough to stop this, and the lawmakers that have been pushing this agenda, chief among them, Senator Lee. This is wildly unpopular. I think you can see it in the polling that Colorado College does every year, that public lands are a significantly important part of why people live across the West and in these states. Is we want protected public lands to have access to. Senator Lee and his cronies that are pushing this public land sell-off agenda, they know that their proposals are wildly unpopular. That's why they're trying to jam it into a budget reconciliation bill. So there's no oversight in all of this, so that they don't have hearings on all of this. So there isn't time for the backlash to happen and the accountability to happen for them introducing it. We're hoping that they're going to be wrong We're hoping that some of the senators that are currently in public land states that represent these areas that have said they don't support sell off, stand up and do the right thing and push back against it. But I think we're going to see in the next couple of days of whether or not those folks really stand for public lands.
Yeah, who are his cronies? Let's name some names here. Who's on board with Senator Lee's proposal?
Well, that's what's shocking in all of this. I think it's been very, he's been a one-man band in terms of being out there advocating and beating the drum for public land sell-off, at least in the Senate. I think he's had some allies in the House. Representative Amodei from Nevada and Representative Malloy, also from Utah. Both of those individuals introduced the sell-off provision in the House that was ultimately stripped out. But they have both also endorsed what Senator Lee is doing over on the Senate side. I think it's also important to point out that while Senator Lee may be isolated, certainly people aren't stepping up to say, no, 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 Senator Lee, you can't put this into your pieces of legislation or into the budget reconciliation bill. So we haven't, gotten an indication of just whether or not the vast majority of the senators are going to push back against Senator Lee. Publicly, he's been the one, leading the charge on sell-off. But we'll see over the course of the next few weeks who, they'll be forced to sign their names on the line and vote one way or another, whether or not they support public lands. And I think we'll get a very clear indication of it. Kurt, I think it's important to point out one of his big allies, and it's not necessarily a senator or a member of the House, is the Trump administration, right? I can't remember a time when presidential candidates made any statements about public lands in general during the campaign. But the Trump administration did, right? And they actually said, hey, we're going to look at, building data centers or selling off public lands for housing during the campaign. They made a push on that and they've continued to do so. Secretary Burgum, who was the governor in the state of North Dakota, has made it pretty clear that he sees federal public lands as something that could be sold off for housing, and he continues to push for that. So Lee has a strong ally in the White House, unfortunately, and within the federal land management agencies under the Trump administration at this point.
Yeah. Now we're recording this on Wednesday, June 18th. Has the measure come up for a vote in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee yet?
It hasn't yet, and the timing seems very uncertain as to when the vote would actually take place. All we can go on right now is the public statements of leadership in the Senate who continue to say that they're trying to get this bill wrapped up before July 4th. That has been their arbitrary deadline since the beginning of this reconciliation process, and they continue to push for that. We think that they have a lot of controversial parts and components of this budget reconciliation bill beyond just the public land sell-off pieces. We think the sheer weight of all of that is more than likely to slow them down over the course of the next few days. But July 4th seems like their deadline so far, and we'll see if it slips into, later into July.
Well, it's really interesting because it would have to go back across the street or across the Capitol to the House of Representatives, and whether they would have the stomach to adopt this land sell-off proposal is really interesting with the very, very slim margin that the Republicans have in the House.
Yeah. Well, look, it's important to note, like the previous House sell-off provision that was in there, introduced by Representative Malloy and Amodei, was stripped out of that piece of legislation because 5 members of Congress stood up and said no. So the margins are pretty thin over there. You're totally right to point that out. We need just a handful of members of the House to stand up and join Representative Zinke, who continues to say he's a no if the Senate sends back over legislation that has sell-off in it. So, if this measure passes the Senate, the game isn't over quite yet. Hopefully the House members who have been courageous in the positions that they've been taking will get one last at-bat with regards to the budget reconciliation bill, and hopefully they'll be able to strip out any of those provisions.
Yeah, yeah. What's your gut tell you? I mean, obviously, Steve Daines and Sheehy possibly have it out because it doesn't affect their state. But are there enough no votes in the Senate, do you think, to derail this legislation?
I mean, I think we'll see what happens. I
Kind of
am
betting man.
I am eternally an optimist in many ways. I know that we've been in an era where people fall in line and do what they're told and join the chorus. But look, I have throughout this entire debate been flabbergasted that Republican members of the Senate and the House don't really see the sale of federal public lands as a third rail issue. It has been for a long time. And members of Congress would, on both sides of the aisle, would stand up and make their voices heard year after year after year that they support public lands. They would work on legislation to protect those public lands, bipartisan legislation, right? That would have Republicans, very conservative members, and very liberal members of Congress championing those efforts. I like to believe that those better angels are still in there. Many of these members who have championed conservation efforts, whether it's Simpson or Zinke or Crapo or Risch, all of whom have done conservation efforts in the past. Um, you know, I'm hoping that they can remember those days, those halcyon days of being champions for conservation, and step up. We'll see. There's extreme pressure on these members to get in line and to move this budget package forward. I think folks that listen to your podcast and folks across the country who care about public lands need to start elevating their voices that we don't want to see this included and make our voices heard and our pressure heard and felt on these members of Congress so that they strip this out and do the right thing ultimately and vote against any of these sell-off provisions.
Yeah, you have to wonder if the general public matters anymore to Congress. I mean, you mentioned the what was it, the Colorado College polling that's done every year and shows wide majorities in favor of public lands and protecting public lands for recreation and whatnot. You've had more than 300 elected local and state officials from across the West say, no, we don't want this to happen. We want to keep our public lands public. And yet, we're at a point where a senator can introduce such legislation without any blowback so far.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've seen this, over the years, right? Senators have extreme power and opportunity to push their ideological agendas forward, right? I think this is, in many cases, Senator Lee sees this as his moment to try and push his agenda forward. And, he is going to pursue it relentlessly. I think the question is, will these other members of Congress who have, in principle, stood up and said in public that they don't support large-scale sell-off, are they going to have the courage to stand up and push back? I think we'll see.
We'll certainly see. That's Mike Carroll, director of the BLM program for the Wilderness Society. Mike, thanks so much for your time, and we'll check back into as this legislation moves forward or dies in the background.
Kurt, thanks for that. And just so your listeners hear it one more time, call your senator, call your representative, tell them you don't want to see public land sell-off as part of the budget reconciliation package. We need everybody to do their part.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it not only interesting, but alarming. Take a deeper dive on your own into this issue, and if it greatly concerns you, reach out to your congressional delegation and let them know. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.